The survivors use different calendars in their different center of activity all around the world. And for example, this one, it started 7,000 years ago. Why do we have so little artifacts from the initial 6,000 years? Why do we have artifacts mostly from the only last 1,000 years? The ones before that are very few and also look too primitive, and I'm all the time talking about the survivors who must have been even more advanced at that time because, as I say, they are gradually losing their abilities, their technology, and their scientific knowledge. The advanced civilization that existed very long ago on our planet perished almost completely under dramatic circumstances. The small group of superhumans that survived those events placed the bedrock of all that we call civilization and advanced technology. And yet, most of the megalithic structures that most alternative researchers try to drag as much as possible in the past, were built relatively recently, let's say within the last 1,000 years. First of all, most of them are clearly designed to suit the needs of humans of our size, and the initial survivors, were considerably bigger. And second of all, we do not see enough signs of time erosion on these megaliths to date them thousands years back in time. In case of the Khmer and Burma megaliths, which bear identical style to all the megaliths, the famous megaliths around the world, we even see wooden elements like doors and other metal hinges and other parts that are very well preserved and consistent with a building that has been constructed a few hundred years ago, not 10,000 years ago. So question arises, what were these superhuman advanced survivors doing those few thousand years before that, after the destruction of their motherland and before founding the civilization of these megaliths that we know? Where are the artifacts of the times before that? Some artifacts from those times can be found in the very interesting book of Michael Cremo called Forbidden Archaeology. And also in this video I will make an attempt to touch some points that have not been reviewed in the work of Michael Cremo. People did keep record of their really old history. Now we tend to call them legends, but there is much more truth in the legends than in the history that you hear in school. So the so-called legends from all parts of the world, and especially Europe and Asia, confirm that these people came from the north. For convenience sake, from now on I will use the name that the Greeks used for it, Hyperborea. And this was their understanding of the location of Hyperborea, the current North Pole, and they always described it as a place of a very pleasant climate and lush tropical greenery. Its inhabitants lived in eternal peace and beauty and were masters of mystical powers. And these are not just the Greek legends. Absolutely the same description is given in the Vedic literature, which is the best preserved literature written by survivors themselves. And also the same is the situation with the Nordic and Siberian legends. Let's see what the modern science has to say about this region where Hyperborea supposedly existed. Alexander Koltepin is internationally renowned geologist and author of many books. Some 2 weeks ago, a unique conference was organized in Moscow exactly about the ways of the Aryans, their migration ways. And Koltepin gave a very interesting talk on Hyperborea during this conference. The region where the ancient map makers depict Hyperborea is extremely well studied by modern geologists, and the reason is oil drilling. When the ships drill for oil, they unwillingly extract many geological samples as well. And after studying those samples, the geologists have confirmed that yes, indeed, there has been most definitely an ancient continent here. They have found countless remains of various tropical plants, palms and mangoes and all kinds of tropical worm-loving fruits and plants were growing there. So it is true there was a place with a pleasant climate once upon a time over there. Well, that once upon a time, now the geologists refer as being few million years ago. But since in the previous episodes we found out that there are no absolutely reliable dating methods currently known to the modern scientists, we should not take their words as pure and established truth, but rather as a guess. Also, this estimation of 16 or whatever million years ago of the existence of that continent over there is not based on the dating of any organic material, because such dating methods do not exist for such periods of time anyway about organic material. Radiocarbon dating does not have such a big range, but they're rather based on the supposed movements of the tectonic plates. So please don't forget that all the hypotheses about how the plates move and with what speed and when did it happen are purely suggestions and hypotheses. And by the way, there are other options of appearance and disappearance of the continents. Like for example, there are these underground seas, really vast areas that are like seas underground. It is possible, according to geologists, it's also one of the hypotheses, there is a possibility that under certain conditions, vast areas of what is land simply gives in and falls down in this underground sea. And in that way, large areas of land can turn into ocean or sea without the need of movements of the tectonic plates. There are other hypotheses as well. For example, a large chunk of land appears to have been chopped off somewhere in the area of the Kola Peninsula that you see on the map. Geologists have no explanation about how and when did that happen, but they do see some evidence of such separation of a large chunk of land that simply vanished from this peninsula. It didn't erode gradually, it just got broken off. And also the dating in the timeline of history of the so-called Great Flood is maybe much more trickier than you would expect. Usually alternative researchers try to put it some 10 to 12,000 years ago, but there are some facts that really don't fit with this hypothesis. It seems there was either another great flood or this one was in much more recent times, because geologists of all regions that border the Arctic region, not only in Siberia they find mammoths that are entangled in all kinds of trees and land mass, and they didn't die a natural slow death. They really all got buried under monstrous movements of the landmass around, mixed with mud and stones, and everything is just buried together. But it didn't happen 10,000 years ago, because in some of the future episodes I will even show you how when they find these mammoths, some of them, they still have fresh blood flowing. Some of the locals still they eat their meat. It's so fresh. It happened so recently. And mammoths in the same situation, entangled in mud and stones and dead trees, are also found in abundance in North America, in the frozen northern regions. And by the way, this Kola Peninsula, where maybe a huge chunk of land just went missing at some point, is extremely interesting place. And in that full region, also east of it, in the Ural Mountains, where it is still a very wild place, a lot of remains of intelligent activity is found, activity that cannot be attributed to any of the primitive tribes that currently live there, and are supposedly the only tribes that have ever lived there according to modern so-called history. And it is highly likely that the legends of these tribes about the people who lived there before them are actually truth, because artifacts are regularly found that show towards some other advanced civilization that lived in these areas before these tribes. Those areas are currently very cold, inhospitable, with a very scarce population, and basically very rarely humans visit there. And still, sometimes they find and take photographs of very interesting stones. I mean, stones like this with a very regular shape and kind of cutting marks done by some sort of technical equipment, and yet everything around will lay in ruins as if after a heavy bombing of some sort. The general impression one gets is that as if everything is demolished, leveled to the ground. Like, do you notice these very straight cuttings at an even distance? Also, at a couple of locations in this region and many other regions of the world, perfect spheres are found. The tribes that now live there don't have nothing to do with such spheres. They don't make them. They think they have been done by the people who lived there before them. A lot of stones with too many right angles to be naturally formed like this by glaciers or any other natural force, and large megalithic walls, the height of 20-storied building, even in their demolished state, they may seem to be a natural formation at first sight, but when you look at them carefully, you start noticing too many blocks with regular shape. In addition to that, many of the blocks still have some sort of binding material, whatever, cement or something in between them. So there is no question of natural formation upon closer inspection of these sites, and it's not only one of them, it's quite a few of them. I have a separate video about the megaliths of Ural on my channel. These are our modern megaliths over there. Somehow they don't come along as beautiful as the ancient ones. Now we are back to the ancient megaliths. Very often they look like natural formations, but when you pay some close attention, you find out that nature doesn't really make such things. And since those megaliths are rather large, they would be more suitable for larger size humans, and also they're significantly more eroded than the famous megaliths that you hear about on the standard mystery alternative history information sources. Very often drill holes are also found in all this region of the Kola Peninsula, Ural Mountains, Siberia, and definitely the primitive nowadays Mongoloid tribes that live there have nothing to do with such drilling technology. And one common feature about all these megaliths, and by the way, all of the very large size megaliths, we saw it also in that wall of Paraíba in Brazil, they all appear to be in a post-war condition. Look, even the stone has melted at some point here. What in nature could have caused the stone to melt? Also, the Barabara caves in the state of Bihar in India, which themselves already resemble a bunker, just an entry and no windows and very thick rock above. Not only they resemble a bunker, but in the very vicinity there is something that could be the remains of a megalithic structure that would very closely resemble the style of the Ural and Hyperborea region megaliths. Look at these big stones. Um, the cutting in between them, that doesn't form like that in nature. If it was naturally formed, it would be properly eroded, but it is just cutting the stones fit together, perfectly. So it is possible that these were uh, huge megaliths as well, the stones near the Barabara cave. Other megalith that could be really thousands of years old is Tanah Lot in Bali, Indonesia. I mean, here it's very erosion speaks about itself. And another sad and strange feature of many megaliths all around the world is that they have these cup marks that are probably actually wounds of something that has been falling and hitting them from the skies, very similar to the sulfur hits in Sodom and Gomorrah. So these particular marks are from the Ural megaliths, but very similar are found all over. Isn't it time to really start inquiring who, when, and how made these marks? Who was showering, things from the sky upon our megaliths? Something else interesting are the seida stones, again in the Kola Peninsula. Well, not all of them are huge, but some of them are really gigantic. And again, the tribes that now live there have nothing to do with them. And not it's not always clear how have they been placed in such fashion. And then there are these strange piles of what looks like to be industrially manufactured gravel, small stones, and that I don't know. Do they cover something? Do they form some sort of hills? They couldn't have arrived there in a natural way by glaciers or anything like that. So who knows? Is something buried inside, or are they a byproduct of something? Are these traces of something technologically advanced that we are not supposed to see? What is it? And these are rather large hills, and there are many, many dozens of them. What you see around are not blades of grass, these are very high trees. So this is like a tall building, that type of height. And also, after all, why are we being told fairy tales instead of official scientific information? Officially, uh, these are brought by the glaciers, but glaciers don't do that. They don't manufacture gravel, they don't deliver it to a particular spot. Glaciers may scatter chaotically stones, but they don't manufacture piles of stone of different color and place it at one location. The very fact that they are trying to present fairy tales in the disguise of science is very suspicious by itself. Now, the Sami tribes that currently reside on this Kola Peninsula have been a bit in touch with the previous residents and have learned few tricks from them. And even in our modern times, we are talking 1-2 generations ago, they knew the art of controlling people. In India, it's called Vashikaran. When somebody was coming to attack them, they wouldn't respond with military force, but they would simply twist the mind of the enemy and make them crazy, make them go back, make them do whatever they want. I mean, the Samis. This is a well-documented fact, and no wonder that various military groups from various countries have tried to capture Sami shamans and force them to teach them this art unsuccessfully. The shamans refuse to share their secrets on the pretext that the spirits that work with them do not want that. But till date, the phenomenon, or I'm not sure how to call it, it's meryachene, is still happening over there. They do these shamans, they still take people to the other side. I mean, some shamans definitely still can take a single person and really push him through the curtain into the astral plane and keep him under control over there. They no longer use it for military purpose, but well, no wonder in Soviet times some selected 40 shamans were simply murdered. And that's because when you go to the other side, you start knowing too many things. And around the same time, when those 40 Siberian shamans were sentenced to death, was also sentenced to death the Soviet researcher and scholar Barchenko. He was killed because he knew too much. He organized an expedition to the Kola Peninsula. He found various traces of advanced architecture over there, and most importantly, he claimed that he got in touch with a full group of people that could definitely be living survivors. What we can find out only from the letters of Barchenko now is his claim that this small group of people lived in complete isolation. They knew really a lot about the history, and they still knew the ancient art of controlling the world around with their mystic powers. This is from the same area. It's a modern airport. Well, you can conclude what kind of aircrafts have been landing here. So things have been falling from the sky and destroying the stones, the megaliths. Now these were the underground tunnels that were demolished with explosion in very recent times. And these are the megaliths themselves. Something made them even melt and flow. That's not the only place. In the desert of China, we see this. I really wonder what happened to this stone or whatever it was before it started burning and melting at such monstrous temperatures. No wonder that the cities around there are in such a condition. Nobody would build cities in the desert. This was a flourishing green place, and who knows when exactly. Because it's very strange. Everywhere where we have, almost everywhere, we have old advanced civilization, it's now desert. And when it was flourishing, it was all green and tropical. In Egypt, absolutely proven. Everybody knows that. They didn't build these things in the desert. It was pleasantly warm. This is again in China, molten stone. And same thing with those pyramids in Peru, if you remember. Definitely all scientists have taken samples when the civilization was flourishing. It was tropical, it was very pleasant, it was full of lush greenery. And yet all of a sudden, in a very short few thousand years, a full desert have appeared there. And all these deserts, they appear all of a sudden exactly where advanced civilization are flourishing. Do you see now? This is in China. It looks like an exact copy of what was buried in the desert of Saudi Arabia. First I thought it's a dam, but it could be some sort of airport or something, ancient airport. Now this is the archaeological site of Sodom and Gomorrah. It really looks like China, and it was a flourishing green before it got bombed with those sulfur balls. It's not just in the Bible that it says it was raining sulfur. The modern researchers actually discovered sulfur 95% pure, which doesn't occur in nature, and pieces of it were falling from the skies and making cup marks on the stones in Sodom and Gomorrah. This is one of the sulfur balls. I'm showing the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah not as illustration showing that this must have been thousands of years old, technologically advanced city. No, it could be recent as well. But the point is, that's how the ruins could look like of the advanced civilization that everybody is asking where it is. We see advanced tool marks, advanced this, advanced that, and the civilization is missing. Well, that's how it looks like nowadays. Many of its centers were simply bombed with things from the skies, weapons that we don't know much about. Moreover, these unknown weapons, not only they destroy, some people even say they petrify everything, but also they turn the full area into desert after that. But not all the centers of the advanced civilization were destroyed in that way. Many were simply made to sink into the sea. Again, we don't know exactly how did they made it, but there are many examples. For example, this is Venice. The houses in Venice were definitely not built thousands of years ago, and yet when they clean the streets, they find out that many of what nowadays are canals for boats were streets, proper streets at the time when they were built. So that means that there was a significant raise of the ocean levels, sea levels, in very recent times, and not some 10,000 years ago as we are being assured all the time. It's not just Venice. Do you remember the previous episode, the semi-submerged channels in Florida and California? And this is again the most puzzling photo of all. This shows that the people who were using electricity lived here, and the wooden poles are still standing. That means it wasn't very long time ago. And yet the full thing is submerged now. The channels are partly underwater. And in both cases, Venice and America, these are locations that are bordering the world oceans or world sea that are connected to the seas that are connected to the world ocean. It's not some local event, let's say the level of some local lake or internal locked sea changed. No, we're speaking about world water levels, and these are not the only examples. So when we are looking about where are the remains of the really advanced civilization, well, they got destroyed in many ways. Some of them got bombed with unknown things. Some of them got submerged, and yet others got simply buried with sand or mud. Some places, the sand in the desert looks as if it has been simply dumped from above over there. Various locations, especially the northern part of Russia, the one that was nearest to the region of Hyperborea. Now it is unpleasantly cold, but in very recent time it was pleasantly warm and nice to live there. Places, cities are selectively buried under few meters of mud. First of all, this is a whole lot of clay. And the main question is why it's only the cities. Pay attention at this wall, only the tips of the arches are sticking out of the ground. The rest is buried, and this was a city wall. It was a high protective wall. Now it's completely buried under mud, under a layer of clay, and below that the archaeologists find the layer with humus and proper soil that was there before this fell from the skies or whatever, wherever it came from. The thing is that the fields around are not in this condition. It is only the cities. Not the only example. Huge land masses of clay, sometimes mixed with other stuff, seems to selectively fall exactly on the centers of the advanced civilization. Do you remember the pyramid of Cholula or Teotihuacan? Absolutely the same situation. It really doesn't look like some sort of natural disaster. Let's see an interesting example of sands that have landed out of nowhere. Those are the Chara Sands in Siberia. The region around is green in general, and yet out of nowhere there is this isle of desert some 10 kilometers long. The official explanation of the formation of this mini desert is that, rivers were carrying this sand from far away places, and gradually as the climate changed, the water formed some sort of lake, so the sands continued to move with the waters. And eventually, when the lake dried up, they remained there at the bottom of lake that existed long time ago, and it's no longer there, but the sands are now only left. Who knows, that could be maybe even possible if the place where the desert is was indeed lower than the surrounding region, but that is not at all the case. It is absolutely even and has the same altitude as the lands around it. Moreover, below the sand, if you clean up the sand a little bit, there is an absolutely fertile land with humus showing below it, and very soon plants start growing over there if you remove the sand. So there are no traces of old rivers or lakes. The land was normal as everywhere else around before this whole lot of sand landed there. If it was carried by some sort of natural sources, they would scatter it all around the valley. Let's see another, even more vivid example, the Caspian Sea. There are vast desert areas on its shore nowadays. Modern so-called scientists loudly assure us that this sand got formed by slowly grinding various boulders, rocks and mountains, but that takes millions of years and does not at all fit the historic artifacts and old maps. See, map of the Caspian Sea made just few hundred years ago. First of all, the Caspian Sea itself has a completely different form that it has nowadays, completely different. And second of all, the full region is full of flourishing cities that are also mentioned in old chronicles. And all that was not the result of the sick imagination of medieval cartographers who just wanted to put something because it looked too blank out there in the desert. No, it was indeed green, and nowadays definitely traces are found of flourishing communities that lived in those areas. And really the same question surfaces again and again. How come we are being assured that these deserts appeared as a result of millions of years of grinding of stones, and yet again and again in history we see that these were green and vibrant societies just a few hundred years ago. In few hundred years there is not enough time for the wind to grind and the rivers to grind all the stone and carry it exactly at the desired location, where by chance exactly always there were flourishing advanced civilizations. And when the so-called scientists themselves start becoming aware that they sound ridiculous, they start inventing other fairy tales. Like they start blaming the formation of the deserts to ecological catastrophes brought about the ancient people. But if all the stories that they are telling us are true, that is almost impossible. I mean, how these primitive people, armed only with simple shovels and hoes, could dig within 100 years, transform the landscape in such an unimaginable way, although they were in much less numbers than us nowadays, to change the completely climate of full regions of the world. It's not only this desert, I mean all the others, Sahara, also in Peru, everywhere there were vibrant societies living in pleasant tropical climate, and all of a sudden usually within a few hundred years, or let's say even 1 or 2 or 3,000, because they're artificially trying to extend the history back in time, you cannot bring about such an ecological disaster within such a short time. Just by tilling the land with very, very primitive tools, and all that done in very small numbers, because supposedly there were very few humans at that time, according to mainstream history. And even if they caused some sort of local ecological disasters, still that does not explain how did all the sand appear. Theoretically, from what we are told, that should be the result of grinding the rocks by the weather and water for millions of years. And that's not the only problem with the fairy tales they're telling us. The origin of sand itself is quite suspicious thing. Actually, some people absolutely unrelated to this topic doubt its natural origin. Because the way it is formed and how it got formed exactly. But anyway, that's another very long story. What is more relevant to our topic is that by studying the particular particles of the sand, the scientists can determine from which place did it originate. I mean, which rocks have such composition and eventually got ground by the weather and formed a sand. So in the case of the Caspian Sea, they cannot find any such rocks around whatsoever. That's why the story they tell us is that these were very, very ancient sands, and they traveled around for thousands of kilometers back and forth before they landed on their current place. Really very strange. Apparently, this large desert was traveling around for millions of years, and yet our forefathers didn't notice it at all some 300-400 years ago, when there were communities flourishing in that tropical area over there where the sands were supposedly traveling. Further, scientists assure us that even the mountains that got the ground to produce this sand do not even exist anymore, because there are no mountains around with such a composition. And the nearest kins, or so to say relatives, of rocks that have such composition are some thousands kilometers away in Belarus or some other countries actually. And how did they arrive if there are mountains on the way? I mean, the sands, how did they cross the mountains? The rivers, as far as I know, tend to flow downwards if they were carrying, they always assure us that the rivers were carrying the sand. Rivers don't tend to go upwards and deliver sand to the desired area unless they are helped by some external force. And most likely there were no rivers at all, and it was something else that dumped all this sand in all the deserts actually around the world. It is not just one. There was a very interesting past life regression recorded years ago by a lady who remembered her past lives. I'm sure she was not aware with the ideas I'm presenting, because probably they were not out there at that time anyway. So she remembered how I really forgot how many, was it 30,000 years ago? She was a shaman of a tribe, and the full planet Earth had a very pleasant climate everywhere. People were living beautiful and clean lives in harmony with nature. And then the evil forces, the parasites, started taking over, and it was them who created the deserts on the face of Earth. They were spitting their poison in the form of deserts. She even remembered how she led her tribe to safety, to the regions that were not affected by the parasitic poisoning. Later on, she returned to the desert areas and tried with all her force by fasting and other methods to counteract this poisoning, to return the affected areas to the original residents. But she was too weak. She was just one against many, and she eventually died over there from fasting. She could not reach her goal. I have spoken many times about the reliability of the historic records taken from past life regressions, so they should not be taken lightly. Also remember the episode about Egypt, where they found this cemetery with thousands, was it thousand or thousand very tall Caucasian people buried, some of them under 30 meters of ground above them. That is very strange. Who would dig 30 meters deep grave, especially mass grave? That's a huge work. More likely, these 30 meters landed there after the burial. I really hope this video will trigger further research into the artificial origin of some or maybe even all deserts on Earth. Because some of our most exciting historic artifacts are still probably buried there. Those that didn't get petrified or just destroyed by the bombing. And what bombing? Once upon a time there was a city called Ekaterinburg. Nowadays it is called Dnepropetrovsk and it's located on the territory of Ukraine. This is 2,500 years old map of this city, Ekaterinburg. This is how it looked then. It had even its star fort, a hallmark of the survivor culture. So it was a proper city at that time. And how does it look nowadays? A huge crater, partially submerged underwater. These are the two maps combined. It's obviously the same place, the name is the same, the rivers and everything matches. There was no huge meteorite that fell and destroyed the city some 200 years ago. So many people are aware about the wars of the gods in ancient times by after watching various mystery documentaries, but very few are aware that this is an ongoing thing, and it didn't stop a few thousand years ago, but it continues. Many of the so-called meteor craters don't look like such at all. For example, this is a real meteor or meteorite crater. It does look like some really tangible body from the skies hit the earth and wounded it. While many other craters look completely different, they are just so regular and show exactly the hallmarks of nuclear bomb. Like perfect and smooth edges, also very shallow, absolutely regular form. These are not meteor craters, and it is not nice that they are presented in such a misleading way to us. There is a team of researchers who run the so-called Thunderbolt project, and they have started working in a very nice direction. They have noticed that there is a lot of electromagnetic nature to many phenomena around us in the universe that have been mistakenly labeled as other things. So they're definitely looking at the right way, because the technology of the survivors was a fine so-called astral science based on the electromagnetic nature of many events, and eventually how they're connected to the electromagnetic nature of our thoughts. So the Thunderbolt project team correctly observed that many craters and other stuff is a result of electromagnetic phenomena. However, they accept the mainstream history assumption that the people in the past were only primitive on this earth, although they themselves complain, the Thunderbolt project staff, that physics is based on underlying assumptions that somebody set us through, and subsequently everybody is obliged to just follow them in order to be an official physic, and those assumptions at the end prove to be wrong. Still, they don't take into consideration that the history is also based on such an assumptions that somebody assumed or defined at some time and are not based on anything proven or any reality. So they are against the assumptions in physics, but they accept the assumptions in history. So if they need to improve and see the full picture, they should ask themselves a question: why such craters are found exactly in the vicinity of the centers of the old advanced civilizations? They should take the full big picture into consideration. How come such craters are found always near the centers of the advanced civilization, and how come after them there is always desert, and before that there was always green and lush place with pleasant climate? In other words, they're going the right way by noticing the electromagnetic nature of the reality around us. creating the hologram that we live in and we consider a solid world, at least most of us. But the next step for them is to notice that the events in this hologram do not happen by some chaotic randomness, but they are designed. And when they start noticing this, they will also notice that the people they label as primitive knew much better what are they talking about. And they're labeling their primitive descriptions as unintelligible and naive simply because they do not understand them well. It is us who are the primitive ones. When we hear a so-called primitive legend that this and this being in the skies decided to destroy the human race and send thunderbolts and fires and all kinds of weapons to Earth, that at the end will prove to be the exact truth. And those who label this as a primitive naive descriptions are just not understanding it, and they are the primitive ones, the ones who don't understand it nowadays, not the people who created the legends. Let's see a few more other locations that possibly could be remains of that very old advanced civilization. Now on the left side of the Red Sea there are a series of ditches. They are regularly spaced and they are all of the same shape as if a gigantic comb made them all. This doesn't occur naturally. And so do those straight lines that go across all across the Red Sea. Now this underwater valley is quite regularly shaped and doesn't seem to have appeared naturally. It really looks like traces of some sort of mechanic work. I mean, our machines nowadays leave very similar traces. Now the top arrow shows a natural slope and the down one shows something that has machine marks on it, regularly spaced, you know. And just look at them. Such things are not observed to happen in nature. Straight line here, suspiciously straight. Another straight one, more than 1,000 kilometers long. This also seems to be too regular to be natural. Now this string of pearls of islands seems to be too regularly spaced. Also interesting marks below water in the area of Hawaii. There is no guarantee that it is exactly the survivors who left these marks, but they are definitely a proof about highly advanced civilizations that were operating or maybe are still operating right now on Earth. And I'm showing this for that group of people who always ask where are your advanced superhumans. They must have left something. Yes, they have left a lot. It is just question of looking at it, spending a few minutes to have a look at it, that's all. But many people find it very hard to bid farewell to the idea that they have been monkeys once upon a time, because then they will have no excuse for their current monkey behavior nowadays. That's why they find it uncomfortable, and they just don't look at the proofs I was just showing. They prefer not to watch such things and simply don't want to go into details that all this Darwin's theory originated and got spread in the society in a very suspicious way and is maintained by mass media propaganda instead of science. And even those who do notice that, many of them still continue to believe in it on the simple grounds that you see, okay, all this missing link thing is fishy, but after all, we and the monkeys share the very same chromosomes. So we must have originated somehow or other from them. They don't take into consideration the fact that the similarities in the design between us and monkeys and all animals and plants on our planet could point out to the fact that we have been made by the same engineers in the beginning. Many machines and robots that we manufacture share a lot of common parts, but that doesn't mean that one of the robots came up with all the others, although he is intelligent in a way. No, the engineer was somebody else. Just similar parts were used in the making, that's all. And yes, humans and animals are amazing creatures. We do adapt to our environment. Yes, within what is called in biology family, the term family, the species do vary within a family a lot. They do adjust to their environment. That is observed indeed in nature, but it is never observed in nature that one family turns into another. No, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen, but something else happens. What happens is that once we believe that we are monkeys, we started finding it normals to be controlled like monkeys and to go on a lower level of just fighting for food and basics in our lives, although our potential is much, much bigger than that. Other possible locations where the real old knowledge was kept are this type of cities. This one is from Uzbekistan. Koi Kirilgan Kala. The more famous one is Arkaim. Here you see it on the left compared to Koi Kirilgan Kala, but this especially the Koi Kirilgan Kala very much resembles the things we saw in America. This is from America, same round design. Interestingly enough, after the archaeologists excavated Koyakirkan Kala, they decided to bury it back, and nowadays only the very inner circle is sticking out of the ground. They even avoid publishing photos of it in this fully open state. God knows what it's around there where it hasn't been excavated. And again, all around is desert. Was it really desert when they built it at the time when it was, I mean, in use? Was it really their style of living to just always go and live in the most inhospitable places? I really doubt it. And going back a bit to all this sand origin stuff, there are definitely hypotheses that the sandstone got formed after it mysteriously landed or started appearing on Earth from somewhere, and that is why sometimes such curious shapes like these waves were formed. The sand that was below the wave could not get solid because it didn't have enough oxygen or something like this. The hypothesis is like this. Or in other words, first the sand appeared and then the sandstone, and now really naturally the sandstone is decomposing again and creating more sand. And this dumping things from above continues even nowadays, maybe not in such a large scale as at some other points in the past, but there are some strange reports like the so-called Formatia Alexandrovka 2000 that apparently happened in a village in the district of Kiev. 7th of February year 2000, sometime after midnight, the residents were woken up by the dogs, and they saw four black formations on the snow. The diameter was some 12 meters, orientated strictly north-south, and they were made out of some sort of black dust, and there were no steps or any sign of any human activity on the ground near them. Moreover, another good proof that they were dumped from above is that in the area sometimes there were, some trees or some sort of sheds that were casting kind of a shadow as the thing was falling on the ground, and apparently there was no wind, so all these things they reflected on the ground, like there was when there was a tree around it, there was no or less of this powder on the ground. So definitely this was dumped from above. And what was it? Apparently that was a ground mineral, some sort of a ground sand turned into powder. And such sand with such chemical composition was found only on one place, and that is 400 kilometers away from the location where it was dumped. So yes, and this is labeled as a mystery. And there was another similar case. I lost the link. Over there the amount was much larger, and it was the substance that was dumped was kind of a waste from some sort of coal production or something like that. Again, black powder. Again, it was dumped in some sort of shape, but it was a lot. It equaled the production of was it all plants on Earth for 18 years that used this technology, or one plant for it was a large amount, and ended up in some area, covered some area. And like this, there are mystery reports. These two are particularly from Russia. Maybe in other countries they are as well, but people don't know how to categorize them and what to make out of them. So they're just labeled as a mystery, and there is no systematic study. Many people consider Atlantis and Hyperborea some sort of legendary fantasy places that didn't really exist. And they're not even interested to look further into it. They easily reject it all by saying where are the artifacts of that very advanced civilization. But how are they gonna see ever any artifacts when both areas of Atlantis and Hyperborea are currently underwater? And of course, official historians do very little to excavate as much as possible from the ocean and sea bottoms. And whatever centers of advanced civilization are not submerged, they are most of them are in the desert, and there is also relatively very little endeavor to dig them. In Egypt, those who have been there, they can ask the local people, they will confirm. Everywhere you dig, you find a lot more, but there is nothing done in this respect. And that's to start with. Second, our own idea of what advanced technology should look like is quite primitive, and that is why we expect to find something similar to this. But in reality, those people were much more advanced than this primitive stage, and their technology was like this. And very often, to transform their electromagnetic thoughts into tangible events or objects, they use the medium of sound instead of mechanical mediums as we are trying to use nowadays, because we are being put into that belief that this is the only way, and other options are not mentioned much in the mass media, because the programs have been formatted before being presented to us to fit our very limited idea of reality. Let's take the medicine for example. Uh, Archaeologists find numerous skulls with traces of very complex surgeries done in the past, and the patients have recovered from them successfully. They did not die from them in many cases. And yet they tell us, oh, this is a mystery. We have no clue how they have done it at all. The advanced instruments are missing. We find only simple tools. But this so-called mystery, again, it's not a mystery at all, because the Tibetan medicine is a very good example of this ancient advanced medical knowledge surviving, although in a degraded form, but even till nowadays. There are still many qualified Tibetan doctors. There is a institute of Tibetan medicine in Dharamshala in India. They do educate still doctors, but this knowledge is suppressed. Very few people are aware that even a few hundred years ago, when Tibet was still an isolated kingdom, very complex surgeries were performed. I mean, open heart surgery, open eye surgery, many complex medical procedures were performed. And with what? With this type of tools. This is a preserved authentic set of surgical instruments from Tibet. And this is the modern alternative. That's what's used in the hospital nearby you, aiming at the same effect that the simple tools were delivering. And after all this very expensive, sophisticated equipment, what are results? Much poorer than those obtained by using the primitive tools. Modern patients have their organs removed. They suffer terrific side effects, horrible sequences from this surgery, much lower success rate, much slower recovery. And why not use the old methods? Why? Because instead of poisonous anesthetic and sophisticated technology, the healers of the past were using magic and herbs. Now let's see what we can find about the Atlantis and Hyperborea survivors from the modern DNA studies. The DNA information that I'm gonna present herein is taken from a lecture presented by Anatoly Klosov from Massachusetts, who is really one of the founders of the very science of the DNA genealogy. So he found out that in all the centers where this survivor culture was historically flourishing, the GNA haplogroup is called R1A. So that answers a question that I was asking myself. I didn't know when I started making this documentary, do all white Caucasian people come from the survivor clan or what? Not at all. And there were very surprising and interesting things in the lecture of Klosov. First of all, people of other races can have Caucasian DNA. And there is a very interesting historic example of group of Arabs who resided in Egypt at the time when colonial times started. They decided they don't want to live as slaves, and few thousand of them just gathered their luggage and went to live in the area of nowadays Cameroon. So they carried their DNA because it is always transferred from the father's side. this particular string of information. So all of them now have absolutely Caucasian DNA, but they look completely black African. They speak the local Cameroon language. They look nothing like Arabic people anymore. So apparently by slightly mixing, or to some extent mixing with the local population, and also living in an area where the dark skin is better adapted to the environment, they completely changed their looks. But they visually completely belong to the African race, but DNA wise they completely belong to the Caucasian race. And this is not now this is just an example, not connected with the stories of the survivors. But the Scythians, they not only had the same story, but they did have the survivor DNA as well, so they are another example. So many ancient Scythian burials are found, and those people belonged completely to the Mongoloid race. And yet their DNA was totally and completely Caucasian. Caucasian and survivor DNA. That also happens when certain number of men, apparently the ambassadors of this culture, when the survivors were bringing culture to various nations, they might have sent forward men who would marry maybe plenty of local women or something like that. So because this DNA information is received on the father's side, the children, they kept the DNA, but the racial features are inherited primarily from the mother. That's why that full race looked totally Mongoloid, but the DNA was something else. This is how their descendants look nowadays. This is the current distribution map of this R1A haplogroup DNA group. At this point, probably you wonder why everybody and me describes the survivors as some tall, blonde and fair people, and yet the biggest spot of distribution is India on this map, and the people don't look, at least most of them, tall and blonde over there. In reality, the caste system is still functioning in India, and people tend to marry only within their caste group. They have four main castes. And indeed, those who historically, according to the Vedic literature that I'm always quoting, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, especially the Brahmins, the priests, the uppermost class, the one who, according to the sacred books, have got bloodline from the gods, from the rishis, sages who came to give them this knowledge, they look somewhat different. They have fairer skin compared to the others, and was it some 80-90% of their DNA is purely R1A. So they are really the closest to the survivors, although they can be darker in many cases. I already explained why, because that better suits the current climate there, and because the racial features are inherited mainly on from one's mother. So after hearing the presentation of Mr. Klosov, I myself found out midway through making this Survivor series that what I have been saying earlier, that it's the Indians who preserved best the knowledge in the form of the Vedic literature, the knowledge of the survivors, well, they not only they preserved it best, but they are most direct descendants of those survivors as well. This same group, DNA group, has been also repeatedly discovered in the Quraysh clan, from where supposedly Prophet Muhammad came. When the DNA tested starting occurring all over the world and some Arabs started getting tested, they were surprised in the beginning to discover this group amongst them, because at that time it was labeled as Slavic. As you can see on the map, that's quite a mistaken label for it. But anyway, that was the label at that time. So they were not even coming very public with this information. You know, what are these Slavic genes amongst us? It shouldn't be like this. But when it started surfacing very often in the very Quraysh clan, then those who had this gene started getting proud of belonging to this group. It's a very good example of how the very same thing, the very same fact, but with different labels, is accepted in a different way by people. The ruling clans of Saudi Arabia belong to the very same group, and sure enough, in the desert, if you remember, there were remains of those probably high-tech installations that maybe it was a dam, maybe an airport or something like that, that was showing from below the sands after storm. Some tribes, or now we should call them groups of people, still remember that they came from the Nordic regions. For example, the Venetians. Last year they had a referendum. Some almost 90% voted that they wanted to become separate from Italy. And one of their main arguments was that they belong to different kind of people that came from the north. And actually that's why those wooden pillars that support the houses of Venice above water and haven't rotten for hundreds of years now are actually trees from Siberia. Actually, the sequence of information recorded in the DNA not only can tell us the origin on the father's side of a certain person, but it also carries information approximately more or less when did that bloodline come and mixed with the genes that were there before. In other words, it is absolutely possible to determine which are older genes and which are newcomer genes. So Anatoly Klosov noticed that the scenario of movement of people is exactly the one that is recorded in the book of Veles, about which I spoke in detail in one of the first episodes of the Survivor series. So this is a very strong proof of the genuineness of the information provided in the book of Veles, because if it was really an 18th or even 19th century forgery, as mainstream historians are trying to scream without providing any sensible explanation of those screams, if it was indeed a forgery made at that time, how would the people know about this DNA research that would emerge only in very recent years? That is why Anatoly Klosov organized by his own means, without the support of a mainstream institution, a real scientific expert report. He gathered together number of scientists from various areas and various translators who have attempted to translate the book, because it is in Russian, but in Old Russian, means normal people from the street, Russian speaking, will understand about half of it, and the rest needs some sort of a translation. So for the last half a year he worked on this project, and some 2-3 weeks ago he finally published the result of the teamwork of this dozen, or I don't know, few dozen of scientists and translators. And you can see the published book. Finally we have the book of Veles in some sort of a best possible translation at this point. The Book of Veles focuses exactly on the movements in Asia and Europe of this survivor race that exited Hyperborea and Atlantis thousands of years ago. Actually, I still don't have any reliable information to say, is it Hyperborea and Atlantis, is it Hyperborea or Atlantis. There are some speculations that the Hyperborea meant Atlantis anyway. Were they connected? Some say the Hyperboreans were the good guys and the Atlanteans were carried away, they were misled by the parasites. So really we don't know. There are a lot of ideas, but not many confirmations so far. We are yet to find out that. And this is a typical example of artifact that could very well be connected to Atlantis and Hyperborea. It was found in Ural. It is a very famous artifact. They found out that actually this is a map with the rivers in the Ural region thousands of years ago. Well, the most interesting about this artifact is that the technology that made it possible to prepare this item is unknown to us. We cannot reproduce it. We don't know how to imprint this image on the stone nowadays. The very history of the artifact is also very illustrative of what happens to similar artifacts. Okay, that was the opinion of the experts. They concluded, you know, this technology is out of our reach. It shows a region thousands of years ago, and after that it was exhibited in the museums. It is a very much mainstream accepted artifact, not disputed by anybody. Hundreds of photos were taken from it, and yet it was found a few years ago, and now here and there, and at the moment what is the situation? Nobody knows where is this artifact. And no wonder if in a couple of decades they will start saying, oh, so where is that artifact? Maybe it never existed because it is no longer available. Same like all those reports of the giant skeletons. Oh, it must be some sort of scam. Mainstream history tries to convince us because they are no longer there, right? Another very interesting finding from the village of Rijavchik, made in year 1969, could very well again be from Hyperborean or Atlantean times. A local worker, during his routine mining operations, found a 2-meter long sarcophagus. It was found at the depth at 70 meters before ground level, and it was in the middle of a 20-meter thick coal layer. He opened the sarcophagus, and inside, to his absolute amazement, he saw a perfectly as if sleeping lady of celestial beauty. She appeared as if to be alive, and she was in a kind of a jelly or a liquid stuff of some pinkish or at places a bluish color. She was of an approximate height of 1 meter and 80, and her features would resemble a very fine European lady of as of nowadays, and her amazing crystal clear blue eyes were wide opened. She wore a white dress with embroidery of colorful flowers, and there was some sort of a metal box next to it, maybe the size of a cell phone and the appearance of a cell phone. He called all the villagers, and all of them came to see the amazing sight. The sarcophagus stayed open in this way for half day, so really everybody saw it. Hundreds, I don't know how big is the village, probably, possibly even thousands of people, because there was a full fighter department there and the police department, so they also all of them came to see what's going on. And then the military comrades arrived with a helicopter and immediately took away the finding. Something interesting happened while they were trying to put the sarcophagus in the helicopter. It was too heavy. That's why, to make it easier, they decided to take off the liquid in which the body was preserved. When they put it out, immediately the full body started looking like an ordinary, dark black mummy. It was quite an amazing sight. They were very surprised, and then they put back some of the liquid, and much to everybody's amazement, again, as the liquid touched the body, gradually it started recovering its original color, and from mummy she again started looking like a sleeping lady. And so she departed in the helicopter, and something else that these comrades did was meticulously take all the personal details of everybody who saw her, on the pretext of possible viral infection caused by a dead body. A few days, a professor came to view the area of the village. He was very friendly, and he even gave a lecture in the local club. He assured the locals that this is the most amazing finding ever, that it will rewrite completely the full history of humanity, that tests are going on, and currently they have found out that the textile from which, I don't know if it is even textile, her dress were made cannot be identified. They cannot even find what is it made of at all, and the only thing they could find are some of the chemical elements that compose the pinkish bluish jelly around her, not all, and also that they're working on checking out the metal box. And so, while people were waiting for this most sensational news to be published, there were small notes published in even the central Russian newspapers, and even the biggest communist one called Pravda. There was a small note, but no details. So how the story developed is, after a few weeks, again the fat comrades came and did a thorough searches of all people's houses, searching for the copies of the local newspaper that had an article with a bit more details about in relation to that lecture given by the professor who came after a few days. They took away all the copies and again continued making lists of the people who knew anything about this. A vast area around the finding was declared no entry zone, and the exact location was covered with concrete and closed very tightly. That is how the story ended, more or less. Till date, the journalists are trying to find out what happened actually. They are questioning, even now in post-communist time, they are questioning the officials, but all they can get their hands on is that this is a top secret case, and the only information available about it is that the full area, when they got the news that there was an order that the full area is tightly encircled by soldiers, 3 circles of them just standing next to each other in order to ensure no access to the area. And as far as all these people who ended up on the lists that saw the finding and things like that, those who tried to give interviews in newspapers or question some authorities, within a couple of days of making any such attempts, some calamity happened to them. Maybe a car hit them or a stroke. It was always very quick and misfortunate circumstances, so all of them, those who tried to speak about it or do anything, are now on the other side. Only related case that I can think of is the Lady Day mummy from China. She was also found in some sort of liquid, and she's very well preserved. Just look at the condition of her skin, and she lived hundreds of years ago. Another candidate for Hyperborean / Atlantean times artifact is the proposed existing holographic hall of images in Romania. And yet another one are the archaeological excavations in the village of Tsarichina in Bulgaria. The great surprise of the local villagers, when early morning they found heavy military equipment vehicles to arrive in a great number in their village and start digging without giving any explanation whatsoever to the locals. First of all, they erected some 2-3 meters high portable wall around the site. The current location is somewhere in front of this house that you see now. And they started digging. Only highest rank generals and the president of the country were allowed to enter inside. The ordinary soldiers, they were just collecting the dug-out material and carrying it away in military vehicles. Till date, no explanation has been given to the citizens of the country what was going on. That is why the Bulgarian TV made a documentary, and now I would like to translate for you what the officials have to say about these excavations. It will be not only very sad, but you will have a great laugh. So all these high-ranking generals and the ex-president of Bulgaria simply refused to give any interview or comments on the case. The only people that they could get some information from was an official spokesman of the military in Bulgaria. So let's see his version of the story. He says, and I'm really translating literally, I'm not adding anything. He says that a certain villager, a very ordinary person, nothing special, had a dream at night and decided that in the morning he should immediately go to the military headquarters of the country and tell the people about his dream. And I'm not joking, these are statements of the official statements of the Bulgarian military forces. In his dream, this villager saw the 4 most renowned Bulgarian poets. Please note that there is no mention that the poets told him anything about the digging or anything at all. He just saw 4 poets in his dream. And after telling that to the generals, they decided that the first thing in the morning is that they should dispatch their most elite military forces that should start digging in that village, and the digging continued almost 2 years. The underground tunnel went maybe some few hundred meters deep, and all because a person saw 4 poets in his dream. But they didn't know exactly where to dig. That's why early in the morning they contacted a medium, lady with special astral training. So I don't understand. They're telling us that all this is nonsense, and yet they contact mediums when they need something. The lady was very surprised, and she told them that she cannot depart on the second because she is breastfeeding a really newborn baby. But they were so persistent that they must do it right now, that she had to guide them on the phone where to drive and where to start digging, because it was of extreme urgency. Later on, the military official continues, it is a 1 hour documentary, to repeatedly assure us that yes, they were digging, that's true, but they never found anything, and at the end they stopped digging. That is his version, and he tells the story in great detail, which is again a great laugh. So he says, how did they stop digging after 2 years? There was a change in the management in the military, and when the new boss came, he just opened the files and he noticed that there is some very strange project that somebody is digging for 2 years and not finding anything, and why look further for alien laboratory that has manufactured some of the human races. I beg your pardon, but from where did the alien races land in this military story, in his lies, that he's forgetting his own lies that he was telling 1 hour ago? It was all about some villager having a dream about 4 poets, right? How can I believe this military representative? I'm much more inclined to believe this is the lady, the medium, who also entered the tunnels. And she also tells an amazing story how the original laboratory owners landed there and paid a visit to collect their stuff when they noticed that somebody is coming on their property. I know that many of you will simply find it hard to believe it, but actually the villagers also they were interviewed for this documentary, and they also said that they saw lights landing over there at the hill where it was all going on. Well, at the end, you will hear a very familiar ending. The tunnel was covered. It was heavily cemented, closed as tight as possible, and many heavy mines were placed so that nobody tries to open it. And of course, the military representative says that I don't know anything about any artifacts at all. And really question remains, if they dug to 2 years and didn't find anything, as he is assuring us, why this case still has the status of top secret, like the highest level of secrecy possible, if there was really nothing. Now let's have a look at something that is usually called precession of the equinoxes. So-called historians are trying repeatedly to assure us that primitive people started watching the skies and conducted very sophisticated astronomical observations driven by their need to make a calendar that would ensure the best time for cropping their various plants. And while trying to record when is the best time to plant their potatoes, they even observed things like this. In astronomy, axial precession is a slow and continuous change of the orientation of an astronomical body's rotation axis, namely the Earth in our case. In particular, it refers to the gradual shift of the orientation of Earth's axis in rotation, which, similar to a wobbling top, traces out a pair of cones joined at their apices in a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. So how did these primitive people know about the center of the galaxy to make these most minute calculations of this infinitesimally small angle of rotation of the Earth around this hypothetical center that even, I mean, I cannot find in the sky or think about without getting some information prior to it? And most importantly, how did they not know what are they exactly looking for? Because such minute changes don't affect their potato crops. And moreover, for how many hundreds and thousands of generations were they writing in a very precise mathematical manner their observations so that they can make a conclusion at the end, because these are very, very fine changes. And why would they and how did they write them down if they didn't have supposedly a writing system for all these thousands years? And why? It just makes no sense. If somebody wants to believe it, they can, but I don't. That's how we got the knowledge of the precession in ancient times. And yet, ancient calendars on almost all continents have recorded the fact that they are aware of this precession. How come? So you have a few choices. You can either believe these modern fairy tales by the so-called historians, or believe something much more sensible, and that is what is the history of this knowledge as it is given by the people who have this knowledge themselves. They all say on all continents that this knowledge has been given to them by superior beings. In some places that is given in a simplified form of legend, but in the Vedic literatures there are given even exact details of how these advanced beings gave to us not just astronomy and astrology, but all the sciences, including medicine and technology and everything else. No wonder those ancient books claim themselves to be just a manual of how to use the world around us that has been given by the engineers who manufactured our dress of the soul, and that is our body. Maybe to live happily, it will be more reasonable to use the instructions given in the old books instead of believing so-called historians that get so ridiculous. I mean, the precession is such an obvious example, and moreover, how do they prove that it was all discovered by primitive people gazing at the sky without any sophisticated instruments? As we saw in the episode about China, the full proof are few broken ceramic pots that have a circle with a dot in the middle. That's all. I often repeat that it was the survivors who laid the bedrock of our science and culture and technology and everything. But I would like to clarify to avoid a misunderstanding. There are also other cultures that have been mixed in. For example, the parasitic full culture and technology and lifestyle and belief system is subtly and gradually introduced in the society in an unnoticeable way, because if it was directly offered to the humans, they wouldn't want to accept it, because parasitic lifestyle means suffering. I would like to quote few examples here. These are a couple of examples of how our forefathers used to dress. Just notice the very style of clothing is meant to promote natural beauty, tenderness, and sensitivity towards nature. And such qualities by themselves are conducive for happiness and harmony in life. And all this is being replaced by something else under the innocent pretext of fashion. These are not snapshots from a mental asylum. These are upper scale fashion shows. Implanting similar images in our consciousness promotes insanity and perversion. Our very idea of what beauty is being gradually distorted, so we that first of all accept ugliness and monstrosity of like something normal, and then gradually, if we don't stop all this nonsense, we will be trapped into making it our lifestyle. These type of images are being implanted daily into the consciousness of people who watch TV, because they're in the state of hypnosis while doing that, while watching TV. And hypnosis means a state of high suggestibility. And then people who have been hypnotized and implanted with this ugliness in their consciousness, they themselves wonder, oh, why is the world going wrong? Why can't we stop it? What's going on? If you do not wish to live in an ugly world of violence and nonsense, you should first purify your consciousness as it is described in the user manual for living in this universe on this planet. And after you allow only beautiful beliefs in your consciousness, in your psyche, then a magical world of beauty will manifest around you. You see, this is the interior style of the survivors. If you wish that the world around you looks like this, you should stop watching TV where subtly you are implanted with this type of scenes. These are the usual backgrounds for, modern pop songs, most of the movies and things like that. And we think that we just watch it and it has no effect for us, but in the manual for living on this planet, it's not like this. I mean, all these impressions that are implanted in us, they afterwards manifest and form our living situation and all those things that happen to us as if by chance. And at last, I would like to clarify one more point. This series of the history of the survivors is not meant to fuel hatred towards anybody, even towards the entities that are parasites. Evil is not as bad as we imagine it to be. Evil is just one of our teachers here in the universe. It teaches us what do we manifest, what can we manifest with the power of our thoughts. This is the lesson that we have learned. It is exactly like a chess game. When you sit to play chess with somebody, you don't win by just getting up and punching him and in this way defeating him. That's not interesting. The point is to defeat the other person by following the allowed movements within the chess game. That is the full point about it all. To defeat him with the tools that you are given at the moment. In the same way, our full life as humans is just one big game, and we are given a certain very limited set of tools, much more limited than our real self possesses on the other side. But we, by our own will, place us in this limited situation to learn certain lessons, the lessons of how we can create things around us. The point is not to hate the game. The very fact that somebody is being born as human in this historical situation is already a very brave thing by itself. So let's make the best of what we can in this very difficult game that we have decided to participate in. It really seems that a new, much superior human race is going to emerge probably within the next few hundred years on our planet from within the ashes that we are now burning in. The ashes of the horrors of this world of war that most war and poverty and desperation that most people on this planet live in nowadays. So I think this will come. There will be more on this on the last episode, but I'm just giving a preview. So most probably this will come whatever you do. Anyway, the only choice that you have for yourself is that are you going to join the new human race, or you will decide to continue in an environment that is very similar to what's going on now. Because there will be options for those who have developed taste for the parasitic style of life, they will be able to continue with it as long as they wish.